In the sleepy suburb of Rosemont Point, every lawn was trimmed, every house facade matched the approved palette of muted pastels, and every fence stood precisely 4 feet high. No more, no less. Families settled here for the peace, the uniform look, and the promise that the Rosemont Point Homeowners Association, HOA, would preserve property values. Neighbors typically strolled the sidewalks in the late afternoon, exchanging friendly nods. Children rode bikes under the watchful eyes of parents who took pride in well-groomed flower beds. The local HOA board, composed of 5 elected volunteers, handled disputes, organized seasonal events, and ensured no single yard strayed from the enforced aesthetic. At first glance, this harmony seemed unbreakable. But beneath the quiet facade lay a climate of strict oversight, and not everyone liked being told how to manage their property. Among the strictest enforcers of the HOA rules was Marilyn Westfield, a middle-aged board member with a penchant for peering over fences and scouring bylaw texts. She prided herself on protecting the neighborhood's appearance, though some felt she meddled beyond reason. Little did anyone realize that this unassuming suburb was about to witness a serious act of sabotage, one that would turn an elderly widow's modest vegetable garden into a centerpiece of neighborhood drama. In the aftermath, neighbors would rally together in a way Rosemont Point had never before seen, all thanks to Karen, as they privately nicknamed Marilyn. On the corner of Maple Crescent and Lakeview Drive stood a small, single-story house that belonged to Marion Douglas. She had lived there for nearly 4 decades, initially with her husband, Harold. They had shared a quiet, content life. Harold tended roses in the front yard, while Marion focused on a modest vegetable patch in the backyard. Their synergy made the property both beautiful and productive. When Harold passed away 5 years ago, Marion felt the loss deeply. She continued living in the house, preserving his memory in each rose bush. Tending to her vegetable garden became her solace, a place to channel her grief into something vibrant and sustaining. Neighbors would see her on mild afternoons, kneeling in the soil, coaxing out tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and leafy greens. She gifted produce to friends up and down the block, baskets of plump tomatoes or fresh lettuce, always accompanied by a gentle smile. Marion's garden wasn't elaborate by commercial standards, but it was impressive for a suburban yard. Raised beds, neatly spaced, yielded a surprising bounty for one older widow. She also kept a few herb pots, basil, rosemary, and thyme. Visitors praised her green thumb, and she always humbly replied, "I just follow the sunshine, water, and a little love." Initially, the HOA didn't mind. Marion's property remained tidy, with no unsightly sheds or unapproved structures, and the fence around her backyard concealed most of her greenery from the street. Yet when Marilyn Westfield took a more prominent role in the HOA, she began noticing the unusual quantity of produce Marion harvested. In her mind, anything beyond decorative flowers or a basic lawn was suspicious. She believed that agricultural-level gardening didn't belong in a pristine suburban setting. Marilyn, secretly dubbed Karen by neighbors who found her overbearing, was not the type to admire a thriving vegetable patch. She was the type to question whether the tomatoes might attract bugs or if the vines were crossing property lines. On multiple occasions, she strolled past Marion's fence, pausing to glance over. She'd see trellises supporting cucumbers, rows of lettuce, even a small compost bin in the corner. While most would shrug at a neighbor's green hobby, Marilyn saw potential code violations. She rummaged through the Rosemont Point bylaw documents, searching for anything about farming, soil usage, or permitted vegetation. Finding nothing explicitly barring a robust vegetable garden, she grew frustrated. She complained at HOA meetings about the look of Marion's yard, though it remained unseen from the street unless one peered over the fence, something Marilyn did often. Complaints from neighbors? There were none. In fact, many adored Marion's generosity with her produce. Some weekend mornings, a small basket of tomatoes or cucumbers appeared on doorsteps. Parents appreciated the fresh, pesticide-free food. Children learned about gardening from Mrs. Douglas, who never tired of explaining which insects were beneficial and how seeds sprouted best under gentle care. But in Marilyn's mind, the presence of mini-farms in Rosemont Point threatened uniform aesthetics. She believed large-scale vegetable patches should remain outside city limits, not creeping into suburban backyards. She bided her time, waiting for a chance to force Marion to shrink or remove the garden. Little did she realize how far she would soon go, an act that would backfire spectacularly. On a breezy Thursday night, the monthly HOA meeting convened at the local community clubhouse. Neighbors gathered to discuss typical fare, budget allocations for landscaping, potential updates to the pool area, and scheduling a summer block party. Marion rarely attended these gatherings. Her arthritic knees and preference for quiet evenings dissuaded her from the sometimes long-winded sessions. Marilyn, however, was front and center. During the open discussion portion, she raised the topic of increasing horticultural expansions in residential backyards. She spoke in vague terms about unregulated produce growth, potentially causing fertilizer runoff or attracting rodents. Several people in the audience furrowed their brows, wondering if she was referencing Marion Douglas's garden. But no one voiced direct complaints. Some HOA members responded politely. If there were no direct complaints, why fix what wasn't broken? A father named Jeff Carter pointed out that several families had small veggie plots, and none posed a nuisance. Another mother, Denise Wong, said she wished more neighbors grew fresh produce, as it built community spirit. Feeling cornered, Marilyn insisted that someone's yard is practically a commercial farm. But she couldn't produce evidence that Marion was selling produce or violating any code. The HOA president, an easygoing man named Carl Hensley, concluded that no rule prohibited a resident from having a robust vegetable garden as long as it was well-maintained and didn't cause verifiable issues. Marilyn sank back into her seat, seething. She despised feeling powerless. Over the next few days, she pored over the bylaw text, emailing board members with hypothetical concerns about chemical usage or excessive water runoff. But still, there was no official reason to curtail Marion's beloved garden. Weeks passed, and summer approached. Marion's garden thrived under the warm sun. Plump red tomatoes dangled from vines, cucumbers ballooned in size, and kale leaves unfurled in emerald waves. She lovingly watered each morning, sprinkling compost gently. Occasionally, younger neighbors popped by to chat, marveling at how much the garden produced. She'd wave them off, explaining it was all thanks to good old compost and a little patience. Behind closed doors, Marilyn Westfield stewed. She walked past Marion's side fence daily, noting that the greenery only grew denser. Where some might admire the abundance, Marilyn saw an eyesore that flouted her sense of order. She fixated on a new angle. Maybe Marion's garden qualified as agricultural usage, which might violate local zoning laws. She typed up formal letters to the city planning office, referencing suburban farmland. She pressed the HOA board to investigate soil contamination or pest infiltration. Each attempt fizzled. The city office found no basis to investigate a private vegetable patch of modest scale. The HOA board reiterated that if there was no proven nuisance or code violation, Marion was free to garden. Infuriated, Marilyn began venting to her small circle of like-minded neighbors, yet none seemed willing to join her crusade. After all, most appreciated Marion's produce or found it harmless. As the scorching July sun beamed down, Marilyn's irritation reached a boiling point. She was done waiting for a bureaucratic solution. An ugly thought rooted itself in her mind. If the HOA wouldn't act, perhaps she could take matters into her own hands. A day came when Rosemont Point's weather forecast called for a mild, breezy evening, perfect for discreet mischief. Under the cover of darkness, Marilyn crept into her garage, extracting a stash of heavy-duty lawn chemicals and pesticides. She rarely used them, as the HOA normally discouraged harsh chemicals that might harm local wildlife. Still, she'd kept them from an older homeowner's kit, telling herself they might come in handy one day. That night, around 2 a.m., Marilyn slipped out of her house dressed in dark clothes. She carried the chemical containers in a cloth bag, scanning the street for any watchers. The streetlights cast shadows across the silent suburban block, and not a soul stirred. Heart pounding, she approached Marion's fence. She discovered earlier that the latch on the back gate was old and sometimes didn't lock tightly. Sure enough, a gentle nudge opened the gate. She tiptoed across the yard. The glow of the moon revealed rows of lush plants, each bed carefully tended. Marilyn's breath hissed between her teeth, The vibrancy of Marion's garden only fueled her resentment. Gritting her teeth, she unscrewed the first container and began sprinkling the noxious chemicals onto the soil. She moved from bed to bed, dousing them with pesticide-laced fertilizer that contained who knew what toxins. The thick stench of chemicals rose in the air, stinging her nostrils. Her heart hammered as she realized the enormity of what she was doing, deliberately poisoning a widow's livelihood. But she pushed aside any guilt, telling herself this was necessary to restore normalcy. Before leaving, she glanced back at the glistening trails of poison on the dirt. In the moonlight, Marion's garden looked eerily silent, as if the plants themselves sensed they'd been attacked. Marilyn swiftly retreated, pulling the gate shut behind her. In her mind, she pictured Marion's disappointment when her prized veggies wilted. "Serves her right," Marilyn muttered under her breath. She returned home, unaware that her actions would soon spark the greatest uproar Rosemont Point had ever seen. The next morning, Marion followed her usual routine. Wake early, brew a cup of tea, and shuffle outside to greet her plants. She sensed no immediate warning as she pushed open the fence gate. But the moment she stepped into the garden, her heart lurched, an acrid smell lingered in the air, and the soil appeared streaked with odd white patches. Frowning, Marion leaned down, scooping a handful of the powder-laced dirt. An unfamiliar chemical scent wafted upward, triggering a cough. She spotted the residue splattered across leaves. A growing dread tightened in her chest. She sniffed the air again, suspecting something sinister. Her arthritic knees trembled as she examined each bed, realizing nearly all had been contaminated. Confusion swiftly turned to horror. Who would do such a thing? She'd never harmed anyone. She lived quietly, gave away produce, and asked for little. Tears pricked her eyes, and she sank onto a small wooden stool, too shocked to stand. Stray tomato vines drooped, their leaves coated in a pale chemical sheen. A neighbor, Lydia Hall, happened to be passing by with her morning coffee. Hearing Marion's shaky cries, Lydia peered over the fence and saw the devastation. She rushed in, hugging Marion, who explained in broken words what she'd found. Lydia's hands flew to her mouth, outraged. She called a few other neighbors, and soon a small group gathered to witness the sabotage. Word raced through Rosemont Point. Someone had dumped harmful substances across Marion's beloved vegetable garden, potentially ruining the entire season's crop. Many recognized it wasn't just about vegetables. This was an attack on a kind, elderly widow's well-being. The community's sympathy turned to anger, and speculation swirled about who could be so cruel. By midday, concerned neighbors accompanied Marion as she contacted the local police. An officer arrived, took photos, and filed a vandalism report. Unfortunately, there were no cameras capturing the incident, and no obvious footprints left on the grass. The officer gently explained that, without witnesses or direct evidence, it might be hard to pinpoint the culprit. Marion nodded sadly, wiping her tears. The neighbors also called the county's environmental hotline to ask about soil contamination. A representative advised them to avoid eating any produce that might have come into contact with the unknown chemicals, warning that it could be unsafe. Marion's heart sank. This garden was her source of fresh veggies, and her joy. Amid the chaos, Jeff Carter and Denise Wong from the HOA asked if Marion suspected anyone. She hesitated, uncertain. She'd never crossed swords with anyone, but her mind flickered to the distant memory of rumors about Marilyn Westfield's distaste for her farm. Could Marilyn be that extreme? Marion, gentle by nature, didn't want to accuse someone without proof. Still, rumors spread across Rosemont Point. Marilyn's known hostility toward the garden made her an obvious suspect. A few braver souls confronted her, receiving only her usual haughty denial. "I would never stoop to such vandalism. This must be some random delinquent." Yet her glacial smile did little to dispel suspicion. Meanwhile, the damage was done. Marion's once thriving plants began wilting under the chemical assault. That day, the tomatoes drooped, leaves turning yellow and curling. The basil and parsley shriveled within hours. Over half the garden looked doomed. Heartbroken, Marion considered giving up. At 72, she wasn't sure she had the energy to resoil or replant everything. Seeing Marion's heartbreak galvanized neighbors. They refused to let her garden die without a fight. That very evening, a group of about 10 residents gathered in her backyard. carefully picking out the obviously destroyed plants. They laid tarps over the ground to prevent further spread of the chemicals. Others offered to buy fresh soil, compost, and new seedlings. Lydia Hall took charge. "We can't let whoever did this win," she said, hands on her hips. "We'll get rid of this contaminated soil and rebuild. If we work together, maybe the garden can be salvaged." The crowd murmured agreement. They created a plan. Remove the top layer of poisoned soil, bring in safe topsoil, and test the deeper layers if needed. A local friend offered heavy-duty containers to store contaminated dirt until it could be disposed of properly. Another neighbor, a landscaper named Elliot Ramos, promised he could coordinate an affordable soil replacement. Even the local 4-H club got word and volunteered to donate seeds and seedlings. Most touching of all, a group of volunteers from the nearby Riverton Farmers Market heard the story through social media. They reached out, offering to bring surplus seedlings, organic compost, and gardening expertise. "We can help re-establish the plots," wrote Martina Lopez, the market organizer. No one should lose their garden to cruelty. Marion was overwhelmed by this wave of kindness. As plans formed, people whispered about the suspect, Marilyn Westfield. No one voiced it publicly yet. The goal now was to focus on helping Marion and proving that compassion could outshine sabotage. Yet an undercurrent of resentment toward Marilyn built throughout Rosemont Point, culminating in a determination that her petty hostility would not define the neighborhood. The next weekend, a small caravan of vehicles arrived in Rosemont Point, vans and trucks from the Riverton Farmers Market. Out spilled volunteers carrying bags of organic soil, crates of young tomato and pepper plants, trays of herb seedlings, and more. Martina Lopez, a woman in her 40s with a big smile, led the group, introducing herself to Marion and the neighbors. "We're so sorry this happened," she said gently, patting Marion's hand. "We'll do everything we can to make your garden flourish again." Marion teared up, overwhelmed by such generosity from strangers. One by one, neighbors and market volunteers rolled up their sleeves. The sense of communal purpose was palpable. Some carefully shoveled out the top few inches of contaminated soil, sealing it in heavy plastic bags for disposal. Others spread fresh topsoil and compost, mixing it with the safer lower layers that hadn't been tainted. Meanwhile, children scurried about, offering cups of water or helping in their own small ways. Onlookers included a few from the HOA board, who arrived to ensure that no new violation would arise from the garden makeover. They found nothing amiss. Everyone was simply restoring what Marion had already had. And, after all, there were no bylaws against gardening with community help. Some curious neighbors noticed Marilyn Westfield lurking on the sidewalk, arms folded, watching the flurry of activity with tight lips. She made no move to assist, though. A neighbor, seeing her, glared. Another whispered, "I bet she's furious that they're undoing her sabotage." But no one openly confronted her yet. They were too busy helping Marion. By day's end, the once blighted garden had a fresh bed of soil in each raised plot, new seedlings carefully planted. Volunteers hung supportive notes on the fence, small gestures of encouragement. Though the older, established plants were lost, the new ones offered hope of a mid-late season crop. Exhausted but proud, Marion wiped sweat from her brow, thanking everyone 100 times over. The farmers' market volunteers responded with a simple ethos. That's what community is for. As neighbors chatted post-restoration, sipping lemonade in Marion's yard, Martina Lopez had an offhand idea. "We could do a small pop-up produce stand here," she said. "A mini-market, just on weekends, to celebrate the new garden and maybe help Marion with costs. People could bring extra veggies, or we could sell homemade jam, local honey. The HOA might not love it, but it's on private property." The concept intrigued the crowd. Marion initially laughed, thinking no one would come to her humble backyard for produce. But others insisted it might become a neighborhood attraction, encouraging fresh eating and supporting local farmers. "We can show that sabotage only leads to something bigger and better," said Elliot the landscaper. Of course, the question loomed. Would the HOA allow it? Rosemont Point had rules about commercial activity. But as Martina pointed out, if it was occasional, small-scale, and operating from private property, it might not fall under strict business regulations. And if they framed it as a neighborhood gathering, akin to a yard sale or a bake sale, perhaps it wouldn't violate codes. Marion mulled it over. She was no businesswoman, but she saw how a mini produce stand could recoup some of the money spent on soil, seeds, and upkeep. Plus, it would highlight the positivity of local, sustainable gardening. She found herself smiling at the notion of neighbors wandering over, picking up fresh lettuce or peppers, all while standing in the very spot that had been drenched in poison just weeks earlier. Talk about turning adversity into triumph. They agreed to draft a plan, a small-scale micro-farmers market stand on Marion's yard once or twice a month. The farmers market folks would help supply produce until Marion's new crops matured. Proceeds would go toward the garden, with any surplus donated to a local food bank. It felt like a beautiful way to ensure something good sprang from the sabotage. Word spread quickly about the proposed micro-market. While many neighbors were thrilled, eager for fresh produce right on their street, some worried about the HOA reaction. Indeed, just days after the rumor surfaced, the board's email list lit up with messages from Marilyn Westfield. She labeled the idea a commercial venture, stating Rosemont Point prohibited running a business from home. She insisted the board preemptively banned the mini-market. HOA President Carl Hensley was more measured. He pointed out that yard sales, bake sales, and neighborhood fundraisers were routine in Rosemont Point. As long as traffic and noise stayed within reason, the board rarely intervened. This pop-up produce stand might fall into the same informal category. If it was occasional, short-term, and community-centered rather than a permanent store, there was no direct violation. Marilyn retorted with heated emails about traffic jams on Maple Crescent, strangers milling in the neighborhood, and unregulated produce sales. Some board members gently reminded her that the sabotage was the real scandal. If the neighbors wanted to host a small charitable produce stand, the board had historically permitted similar gatherings. Sensing she had no majority support, Marilyn lobbied for stringent restrictions. "We must cap the number of visitors, hours, and items sold," she wrote. The board debated. In the end, they set minimal guidelines. The stand could only operate on weekends, from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., ensuring no nighttime disturbance. No large signage was allowed on public roads, but a small sign on Marion's fence was fine. They also requested that the volume remain neighborly, no loudspeakers or big crowds. All in all, a relaxed compromise that allowed the project to proceed. Marilyn was incensed. She accused the board of going soft, undermining the refined suburban image of Rosemont Point. She repeated claims that gardening belonged in the countryside. But with most of the community supportive of Marion, her protests fell on deaf ears. The micro-market was on. The lead-up to the first mini-market stand felt electric. Farmers market volunteers coordinated produce offerings, baskets of tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, onions, some from local farms, plus small contributions from neighbors who had extra from their own gardens. Marion's newly planted veggies were too young to harvest in bulk, but she had a handful of herbs that survived or regrew quickly. Martina Lopez arrived early that Saturday, setting up a simple table under a small pop-up canopy in Marion's front yard. A handwritten chalkboard sign read, "Marion's Micro Farmers Market, fresh and local." Next to it, a smaller sign said, "Proceeds support garden restoration and food bank donations." Marion, wearing an old straw hat, bustled around, placing baskets of produce in neat rows. She felt both nervous and excited. She'd never sold anything in her life, let alone run a miniature farmer's market. Neighbors trickled in, curious. Some bought a bag of peppers or a handful of fresh basil. Others simply donated a few dollars to the cause, praising Marion for her resilience. Children pointed at colorful vegetables with interest, while parents explained how fresh produce helps with nutrition. Even passers-by from adjacent blocks, who'd heard of the sabotage story, stopped to show solidarity. By midday, the stand had welcomed a steady stream of customers. Never a crowd large enough to disrupt traffic, but enough to create a festive feel. The warmth in the air was more than the summer sun. It came from neighbors pulling together to transform cruelty into community bonding. Marion's gratitude shone in her eyes. She quietly told Martina that, after Harold's death, she rarely felt the presence of so many caring souls. Now, for the first time in years, she felt a sense of belonging stronger than ever. Meanwhile, behind her window blinds, Marilyn Westfield seethed. She peeked out occasionally, watching cars park briefly, folks chat happily, and children carry away small produce bags. The event was too peaceful for her to call it a nuisance. She cursed under her breath, feeling overshadowed by the very garden she had tried to destroy. The mini-market continued each Saturday, picking up momentum. Families now planned weekend walks to Marion's yard, buying fresh produce or sampling homemade baked goods from neighbors who joined in with pies, bread, or jam. Because it was small-scale and community-oriented, no official commercial license was needed. The HOA's minimal guidelines were respected, so there were no noise or traffic problems. Local social media posts about Marion's market circulated. Photos of bright tomatoes and peppers, smiling kids, and Marion in her straw hat found their way onto community Facebook groups. A handful of local bloggers touted it as a prime example of suburban unity. Some folks even joked it was the friendliest black market produce stand ever, poking fun at the notion that the HOA might ban such wholesome fun. Encouraged by the positive feedback, Martina introduced a donation box for the local food bank. People dropped in spare change or a few dollars. At the end of each weekend, a volunteer took the donation box to the local charity. The synergy was remarkable. Sabotage had birthed a small phenomenon. Gradually, Marion's new crops matured. She harvested modest amounts from the replanted tomatoes, kale, and peppers, adding them to the stand. Each was a quiet testament to resilience. Marilyn, of course, tried to find petty ways to interfere. She complained about line of sight issues with the canopy, claiming it blocked the street view. The board checked and found the canopy was well within yard boundaries. She accused the stand of being a permanent structure, but it was easily foldable, removed after each event. Nothing stuck. Meanwhile, the rest of Rosemont Point glowed with pride at how well the micro-market thrived. Frustrated by the board's unwillingness to ban the market, Marilyn considered more drastic measures. She realized that direct sabotage, like the chemical dump, had only made things bigger and better for Marion. But her hatred of the garden-turned-market burned bright. She yearned for a way to shut it down once and for all. She mulled over city ordinances. While the county allowed temporary produce stands, perhaps she could exploit zoning laws more effectively. If she could find a clause that such stands must keep a certain distance from the curb or require a parking plan, maybe she could push for official condemnation. But a quick inquiry revealed that as long as the stand was on private property and not obstructing sidewalks, there was no clear violation. She then tried sowing seeds of doubt among older residents. "Aren't you worried about strangers showing up?" But few heeded her warnings. The micro-market crowd was mostly local families anyway, plus some out-of-area visitors who posed no threat. If anything, the stand had lowered petty crime rates by keeping watchful eyes around. She tried hinting about potential health code issues, but since the produce was fresh and unprocessed, no special inspection was required for a small community sale. The more she schemed, the more she realized she was outnumbered. Rosemont Point's unity around Marion's cause ran deep. Even the older, conservative neighbors, who typically backed strict HOA rules, found it difficult to oppose something that benefited a sweet widow and local charities. Marilyn fumed, feeling her power slip away. By late summer, Marion's replanted veggies burst with life. The farmers' market volunteers had chosen hardy seedlings suited to a later growing schedule. The sweet peppers matured in bright reds and yellows. The tomatoes glowed with robust hues, and leafy greens like chard and spinach thrived in the cooler nights. Each time Marion stepped into her rejuvenated garden, she felt a twinge of awe. That place, once strewn with poison, now exuded vitality. The micro-market had become a fixture every Saturday. Marion's yard teemed with neighbors sampling new recipes, like cucumber salad or homemade tomato salsa. Occasionally, local artisans or hobbyists added small craft stands, fragrant candles, crochet blankets, or hand-painted pottery. Not wanting to overshadow the produce, they kept it small, but it lent a mini-festival feel. With each passing week, Marion felt more connected to her community than ever before. In the evenings, she'd sit on her porch, knitting or reading, while children rode by on bikes calling, "Hi, Mrs. Douglas." Her sorrow over Harold's absence dulled somewhat, replaced by gratitude for life's new chapter. She often told Lydia, "I never imagined such goodness could come from something so terrible." All the while, Marilyn grew increasingly isolated. Her attempts to incite pushback against the stand fell flat. Even her few allies on the HOA board recognized the micromarket was harmless, even beneficial. Some teased that the area finally had real community spirit, thanks to the sabotage ironically motivating neighbors. Furious, Marilyn seldom left her house on Saturdays, unwilling to witness the joyful scene unfolding just a few doors away. Eventually, the tension between Marilyn and the rest of Rosemont Point reached a breaking point. At another HOA meeting, she proposed a motion to ban recurring yard sales or produce stands, reclassifying them as commercial activities that violated the spirit of a residential zone. She came armed with typed statements, references to a local county code that had borderline relevance. When the time came for discussion, neighbors filled the seats. Marion, though not fond of confrontation, attended, flanked by Lydia, Jeff, Denise, Martina, and other supporters. Marilyn launched into a tirade about how Rosemont Point must remain a dignified suburb, free from daily commercial interference. She alleged that the presence of these stands cheapened the neighborhood and created an inviting environment for chaos. The crowd sat in stunned silence. Finally, Jeff Carter stood. "There hasn't been any chaos, Marilyn. We've had nothing but positive experiences, no traffic jams, no trash. People love supporting Marion and the food bank." Denise Wong added, "My kids have learned so much from seeing how produce grows and helping Marion in the garden. It's a blessing, not a burden." Martina Lopez, though not a resident, was invited to speak. She described the transformation of Marion's yard from a vandalized site into a mini hub of local produce and charity. She concluded by looking directly at Marilyn, saying, "To punish that is beyond comprehension." Marilyn tried to retort, waving a paper about potential health codes. But the HOA president, Carl Hensley, interrupted gently. "We've reviewed the details. The stand operates within guidelines. No real violations or negative impacts have surfaced. The board sees no reason to ban it." He then called for a vote on Marilyn's motion. The result was decisive, 4-1 against. As soon as the final tally was read, thunderous applause erupted from attendees. Marilyn's face turned stony, and she fled the room before the meeting concluded, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The spectacle only solidified the micromarket's acceptance, effectively ending her official campaign against it. After that public defeat, Marilyn's bitterness only deepened. She realized she had no official avenue left to quash Marion's garden or the market. In her frustration, she confided in a longtime friend, one who also disliked overly liberal changes in Rosemont Point. Feeling cornered, Marilyn admitted that months prior, she had taken matters into her own hands by dumping chemicals on Marion's plants, hoping it would end the farm nonsense. The friend, shocked, realized this was a serious act of vandalism. Word quietly leaked that Marilyn had essentially confessed. The friend, disturbed by the gravity of her actions, told a mutual acquaintance, who then whispered it to a third party. Soon, the rumors circulated. Marilyn admitted she was behind the poisoning. Furious neighbors demanded she be held accountable. Some pressed Marion to file a lawsuit or press charges. But Marion, kindly as ever, hesitated, uncertain if she wanted the stress of a legal battle at her age. However, the broader community had no sympathy left for Marilyn. They collectively shunned her. She found herself socially isolated, excluded from gatherings, ignored by neighbors who once waved politely. The local police reopened their vandalism case, this time with a potential suspect. Despite lacking direct proof or her official statement, they questioned her thoroughly. Marilyn, frightened, tried to backtrack, claiming she was just venting with her friend, that she'd never actually done it. But the rumor was unstoppable. The HOA board considered a motion to remove Marilyn for conduct unbecoming an official. They had never done such a thing before, but the membership demanded it. Facing near-certain expulsion, Marilyn resigned her position abruptly, packed up her most valuable belongings, and placed her house on the market. Within weeks, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. The woman who once championed immaculate yards now retreated in disgrace, reaping the consequences of her cruel sabotage. After Marilyn's downfall, Rosemont Point breathed a collective sigh of relief. No longer overshadowed by her negativity, neighbors felt free to expand their own small gardens or experiment with new yard projects. Encouraged by Marion's success, A few families even built raised beds for vegetables, exchanging tips on composting. The HOA, ironically, discovered that a bit of horticultural freedom didn't diminish property values. If anything, it enhanced the neighborhood's appeal. Marion's micromarket stand continued each Saturday. Though the season's peak yield had passed, she and the farmers' market volunteers still managed to offer an assortment of produce. Crisp fall weather arrived, and they introduced baked goods, spiced cider, and small crafts. Children painted pumpkins, turning Marion's yard into a modest autumn festival. The entire spectacle felt surreal to Marion, who never intended to become the neighborhood's central figure. Looking out at her yard, where new growth thrived in lush green and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves, Marion sometimes recalled the dark day she discovered the sabotage. But she refused to dwell on bitterness. Instead, she recognized how tragedy had blossomed into a phenomenon of community spirit. She believed Harold, wherever he was, would be proud to see her yard bursting with life and fellowship. Each new bloom, each fresh tomato, symbolized hope rising from adversity. By mid-autumn, news of Marion's backyard market spread beyond Rosemont Point. A local newspaper published an article titled "Elderly Widow's Garden Sabotaged, Community Responds with Weekend Market." It featured photos of Marion smiling among her vegetables, children holding baskets of peppers, and the small pop-up canopy where neighbors sold or donated goods. The story emphasized how an act of vandalism had catalyzed deeper community bonds. Readers across town praised Rosemont Point for their response, while quietly condemning the unnamed culprit. Some folks from neighboring suburbs visited on Saturdays, curious to see the famed microfarm for themselves. On particularly busy weekends, the stand sold out, raising extra money for the local food bank. Marion's phone rang often, with strangers calling to say how inspiring they found her perseverance. She always replied with humility, crediting the wonderful volunteers and neighbors who had done the heavy lifting. She remained a quiet figure at the center of something bigger than herself, a living testament to resilience, generosity, and the triumph of kindness over pettiness. As the first chill winds of late autumn swept through Rosemont Point, Marion prepared for the final big market day of the season. The plan was to celebrate with a harvest gathering, one last flourish before winter. Neighbors contributed everything from homemade pies to jars of pickled vegetables. The farmers' market volunteers brought apples, gourds, and decorative corn husks, giving the yard a festival vibe. Colorful leaf garlands adorned the fence. A small sign read, "Thank you, Rosemont Point, for turning sabotage into hope." It was Marion's quiet nod to the adversity they'd overcome. Warm cider simmered in a crock pot, filling the air with cinnamon scent. Families arrived with scarves and jackets, excited for the final harvest. At midday, Martina Lopez raised a plastic cup of cider in a toast. To Marion, for being the heart of this project. To the neighbors, for uniting against hatred. And to new beginnings, proof that one cruel act can spark a movement of compassion. Applause rippled through the yard. Marion, blushing, said a few grateful words, her voice trembling with emotion. In that moment, many recalled how close the garden had come to ruin. Chemicals poured in the dead of night by a bitter neighbor. Yet, in the face of cruelty, the community had said no, reseeded the soil, and transformed it into a place of warmth and fellowship. The story resonated with everyone present, a reminder that goodness could sprout from the darkest seeds. Winter settled over Rosemont Point, blanketing the neighborhood in frost. Marion's garden rested, preparing for the next cycle of growth. She spent the cold months flipping through seed catalogs, dreaming of spring. Friends still dropped by for tea, discussing plans for an even better micromarket the following year. Maybe a monthly farm brunch or a children's gardening workshop. Marilyn Westfield's house sold quickly. She left quietly, not saying goodbye. No one openly mourned her departure. A new family moved in, astonished by how welcoming everyone was. They heard the local lore. Beware meddling with Mrs. Douglas's garden. This place won't tolerate sabotage. It was half joking, but underlined the lesson learned. The community's unity was firm. When spring finally arrived, bright green sprouts emerged from Marion's thawed soil. She beamed at each new leaf, recalling the heartbreak of discovering that noxious residue. But those memories felt distant now. Instead, She remembered the day volunteers first arrived with fresh soil. She remembered children's laughter at the Saturday stand and the crisp smell of basil bunched in neat rubber bands. And so, the sabotage that had once seemed an unthinkable cruelty became the catalyst for the best of Rosemont Point's humanity. Marion's yard stood not only as a place for fresh produce, but a symbol of how neighbors, united by decency and empathy, could transform even the most toxic acts into something abundantly good. In the end, Karen's chemicals didn't kill the garden's spirit. They fertilized it, spurring a harvest of kindness that flourished for seasons to come.